I hope you people are able to see my screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, in our two previous sessions, we talked about a few of the things in Playwright. We understood like what is the advantage of Playwright, why mostly people and organizations are going towards Playwright. What are the other advantages that we have? How can we set it up that we have not seen, but we'll see like in our going forward session whenever we start with the Playwright that how easy it is in terms of setting up. As we have discussed, like there are just a simple command that we have to write to install the Playwright, which is npm init Playwright. We had seen this other day inside a document, which is npm init and Playwright, like to basically install the complete framework of Playwright. Now, after that, like we have seen, how can we start writing the test case? Generally, how do we start writing the test case? What we have we have also seen basically like if we have to test something in terms of manually, how do we do that? And then how do we convert those script into test automation by using one of our dummy application? And then we have understood a concept like what is select like how do we select the value from a drop down, and that we have seen how do we select a value from the static drop down which have been developed using select tag. So there will be different kind of drop down that we have discussed earlier, like whenever drop down that have been developed using select tag, how do we handle that? Whenever there will be a drop down that have been developed using non-select tag, how do we handle that? So in terms of uh, select tag in the sense like whenever we have whenever we have an application which is let's say example drop down. So in terms of drop down, we have some other values that we can see as a part of widgets. So whenever we have different kind of values from the drop down in terms of handling some of the drop down, like develop some of the drop down will be developed using a select tag, some of the drop down will be developed using non-select tag. That can be anything apart from select tag. So if you see this drop down, which is a multi-select drop down, have been developed using a select tag over here. And then if you talk about the other drop down that we have on this page, those have been developed using non-select tag, which they have used a tag name as div over here. Okay, so handling select tag and non-select tag is entirely different in terms of Playwright. Whenever we have to handle a select like drop down that have been developed using select tag, we have a select option as a method that Playwright has given. And other thing, whenever we have drop down that have been developed using non-select tag, it can be div, li, ul, or any other things. At that point of time, what we have to do is we have to generally use a click method on the element that we are trying to select. So first, we have to open the drop down. That means first we have to click on, let's say if this is a drop down that we are trying to automate. So what we'll be doing is we'll launch the URL, then we'll try to identify this particular element. And as soon as we identify, we click on this element. And then let's say if we have to select group one option two, we also have to click on this particular dropdown to select the value from a dropdown whenever whenever any kind of dropdown have been developed using non-select tag. Here it is developed using div. Okay, so only the click operation that we have to make it like first identify the drop down, then click on the drop down, whatever the value that we have to select, we can click on this particular options that options that we would like to select from the drop down. Okay. As part of our next continuation of the session, we will be, as discussed earlier, we'll be having three sessions, which will be like completely public, where we'll be discussing regarding the Playwright. And from the fourth session onwards, we'll be starting with complete JavaScript. So from tomorrow onwards, we'll go through with understanding of JavaScript, installation of like JavaScript, Visual Studio Code. We'll see like different kind of installation, and then we'll also start with a basics of JavaScript from next session onwards. Today, we'll see in terms of a Playwright that as we talked about the advantage of Playwright, there we had discussed one of advantage that whenever we use, let's say whenever we use a Playwright, we have a feature that Playwright has a built-in support of API. So if you see this particular document, it says that Playwright has a built-in support of APIs, API libraries. Okay, so we'll see one simple example that how do we take the advantage of API like Playwright API to handle the APIs, like whenever we have to take care of, like, let's say a combination of or a mix of web and API automation. How can we do those kind of scenarios? Okay, so let's see a simple example in our today's session where we'll talk about the basics of API automation. First, we'll go through with understanding of how do we handle API by using a manual testing, for that we'll be using a Playwright tool. First, I'll show you, like, let's say if we have a API requirement, how do we construct the API? What kind of different scenarios that we require in terms of handling the API in manually, and then we'll go to automate those manual part in terms of automation using the Playwright and JavaScript itself. Okay, so for that, I'll create one more file, which I'll just give the name as, say, api.spec.js. Okay, so first thing, I have one of application that we'll going through with in terms of our example of the API. So this is one of our application that we have here. This is the URL that we have for logging into the application. Okay, so in general, what also, like, if you people have any kind of questions in between, you can stop me in between itself, so that I'll try to answer there itself. Okay, so what I'll do over here is, so here,
How do we know that here is an API is called?
I'll explain in the next few minutes. I'll explain in the next few minutes. So this is one of a application. This is known as a front-end application. This is basically a front end where a user interacts with on the page. So let's say if you have to log in into the application, we have to provide some kind of username, password, and then we have to click on login button. As a user, I do not take, I like, we do not care of what kind of API is getting called. So whenever any of the application will be developed, let's say either this one or the one that we are trying to discuss right now, or any of the application that we see over here, any of the application, whenever they will try to develop, there will be three things that will happen in between. One is we require a front-end system. What is front-end? The UI application that we basically see as a user is known as a front-end. Every time, whenever there will be an application development, as an end user, we'll only be able to see the front-end application, which is also known as UI, user interface. Okay. Then second things will be a backend. And third thing will be a database. So whenever any kind of application will be developed, we need these three things as a minimum requirement to develop, and any of the end user can use the front end application or any of the application in terms of web application. Okay. Now example, this is an application which have been developed using all these codes that we see over here. Okay, these are the codes that have been written to develop this particular application. Now, example for this one, we have these codes that have been developed that have been written to develop this particular application, right? Now this is front-end application. We do not know like how, let's say example, whenever we enter a username and password. Example, I'm trying to enter a username and I'm trying to enter some kind of random password over here, right? And when I click on this, when I click on login button, it is throwing me incorrect email or password. How is it able to identify that I have entered wrong information of either email or password, right? So for that, what happened is whenever we click on a login button, whenever we click on a login button, this front end system will talk to backend system. Backend is the API that will be the development team will create some kind of API which will be helpful for us in terms of navigating the data, displaying the data on the UI, navigating the user from one page to other page, and so on. Okay, we generally do not know, like let's say if I have provided the correct information over here, whatever the information that it requires us for entering into the application, we do not know what happened internally and we get navigated to the dashboard over here, right? So we do not know what kind of logic that the development team have written. Every time, whenever we do any kind of action on the application, there will be an API will get called, and that API will talk between front end and back end. Okay, what is backend? The API that that it is interacting between the front end and backend. So backend um, is like so for front end there will be a different kind of language. It can be a HTML, it can be HTML, CSS, it can be let's Ajax, it can be React, Angular, and so on. For backend, it can be, let's say, a Java. They can use a Java language to develop an application API, which is also known as application programming interface. There can be a Golang or any other. Uh, there can be a Golang, any other popular language that they can use for. And then we have a database where we can have a MySQL database, MongoDB. We can have some other example of a database, which is Postgre, or Postgres, and some other example. So what happened is like whenever we whenever we try to enter the username and password over here, and we click on login button, an API will get called, and that API we can validate inside a network tab over here. Whenever we do any kind of operation inside a UI, which is application, every time there will be an API get called, and that API information we can check inside network tab. How do we come to this network tab? You can go to the application, right click on any of the application, click on inspect. It will take us to the elements tab, and from here we can move to network tab. Okay, so whenever let's say example over here, login. I am trying to provide some kind of information over here, and then I click on login button. So how does this system able to authenticate or understand that I am a correct user? And sometimes when we provide incorrect information, how it is able to understand that I am not a correct user? So that happens whenever a front end and back end system talk using the API. Whenever we click on login, an API will get called over here, and that API will also interact with the database to check whether this user is available in the database or not. Okay. If this user is available, then the password that we have entered over here, whether that password is correct or not, that this API, whenever we click on this, API will get called, and that will try to validate the data from the database. If that is correct, then it will pass the API. If this information is wrong, then it will basically fail the API. Example, let's say I'm just removing one word from the password. If I click on login, you can see that if there is a login call happened over here, right? And this is an API. If you click on this, you will get all the details of the API that it is throwing over here. This is an application, a dummy application that we are currently going through. I know the complete information of this. Whenever you work in any of the team, in any of the organization, the complete API details will be provided by your development team. So they'll provide the complete API details. What those details will be, whatever we see over here, like what will be the API, what will be the method for the API, what should be the status code whenever we provide correct information, whenever we provide incorrect information. Every details they will provide you. What kind of a body that we have to send, what should be the response value in case of like error, what will be the incorrect information, what will be the response value in terms of correct information, what will be the response value, and so on. So every details that will be provided in your organization by your development team. Now I've provided the correct information over here. If you click on login button, here also we can see that an API again get called over here, which is similar API, which is login over here. Now this time, if you compare the previous API, which is also similar, there is no difference in terms of the API that it is getting called. There is no difference in terms of the request method because it is accepting a post call over here. But there is a difference in status code. Here it is throwing 400 bad request and response it is saying incorrect email or password. In terms of this, if you see, it is saying 200 okay. That means the API have been passed successfully. The payload, that means the information that I had given at the time of clicking on the login, is available inside the database. So it is able to validate and it has provided us some kind of response, which is token, user ID, message, and so on. Okay. And now by using this token, whatever it has generated, every time, whatever we do any kind of action inside the page. Okay. Every time, whenever we try to do any kind of actions inside this particular application, this token will be provided along with the API call. Okay, let's say what I am talking over here. So this is the token that let me copy paste somewhere that we can see over here. I'll copy it from here directly. Let's store it somewhere over here. I'm trying to store here. This is the token that it has generated. And by using this token, now every time it will be able to identify that what user are trying to do and whether this user have been authenticated or not. Okay, so let's say I'm trying to place an order. Let's say I have selected a product over here. Again, we'll see like different kind of API are getting called. Then after adding to this card, it will again call some kind of API. Again, if you click on checkout, you'll see like different types of actions that are performing over here. Now let's say I'm selecting, this is a drop down, which is a dynamic in nature. I'm selecting India from the drop down. And after this also, as soon as I click on place order, you'll see order will be placed. Okay, and again API will be called over here as well. So if I click on this place order, we can see that a create order API have been called over here. This create order, right? And it had generated some kind of order, which is order ID as well. It has generated over here. Now, what is the API for this? This is the API. As I said, in terms of organization, all the information will be given by the development team. I have gone through with this application, so I know what kind of API it is calling, what kind of method it is having, what should be the status code, and so on. What will be the payload? Payload in the sense, the input value that it requires at the time of placing the order. So what kind of input that it required? It required a product order ID. That means we have selected one of a product and that product was Adidas original from the application, right? So that product ID, it is displaying over here as a payload. And then we have selected a country from the dropdown. So these two are the information that it has provided as a payload. What is meant by payload? The input value, that means the product and the country that we have selected inside the web application. Okay, and now if you see the response, it has generated an order which is similar to this order ID ending with 5223, ending with 5223 over here. Product ID that we have selected, if you see at inside the payload, it is ending with FAF, starting with 658. Inside the response as well, we can see starting with 658, ending with FAF, and then the message which is order placed successfully. Right now, why I'm trying to show this? If you go inside a header tab inside the API, if you go inside a header tab inside the API, we will get one information known as request header. So if you see this one, this is known as a request header. So at the time of placing this order, this also sent one kind of information, which is authorization. And this authorization is the token that it has generated over here in response. This has generated at the time of login into the application. And now every time when this user will perform any kind of action on the application, this token will be provided along with the API call. Now for that, if you see the create order ID and go inside the headers, go to request headers, we can see the authorization code that it has provided. And this is the similar token that it has generated. Earlier we had copied this. And now if we compare these two tokens, we can see that everything is same. That means by using this token, it is able to identify that a user which have been logged in, and for the user that we have created a token, that token, by using that particular token, this application is able to understand what user have placed the order. Okay, which of the user have placed the order inside this particular application. If they do not maintain this, then they'll not understand which user are trying to place the order, what kind of order they are trying to place, where do we have to display all these kind of information, and so on. Okay, so this generally happens in terms of the API. Whenever you try to do any kind of actions on the web application, this will interact with the API call. Every time whenever we do any kind of action, there will be an API call happen in in backend, and whatever the API that is intended to for, let's say, logging into the application, placing the order, checking the orders details, going to the cards and so on. Every API will try to validate the data from the database as well. So that is where we saw that whenever any of the application will be developed, there will be three things as a minimum requirement. One is front end, second is back end, and third is database. Front end and back end will interact with an API, whatever the API call that we have seen. And then internally, this back end will also interact with the database using the API itself. Okay, now let's see how does it happen in terms of manual testing. Let's say if I have given a requirement that that I have to check whether the login is working in terms of login page is working in terms of API testing or not. Okay, so what are the minimum things that we require is whenever we have to go for API testing, whenever we have to go for either a manual API testing or automation API testing, we require a couple of things. One is, what is the request URL? Okay, we need a URL. That means an API. What kind of API we have to call? Second, what is the method that we are trying to use? Method of the API. So there'll be different method. Most popular are get, post, put, and delete. We'll discuss this once we start the Playwright as well. But these are most popular, which is get, post, put, delete. So what kind of API that the request is trying to use? So if you try to see over here, let's go one by, along with the request and response itself. So I click, like here, I'm trying to click on login button, and API get called over here. We require a request URL, which is API. We require a request method, which is post over here. And then after that, we also require what kind of status code it will display as a part of result, as a part of result or response. Okay. Next thing we require whether this API also requires some kind of input data. Input data means a payload, whether it requires some kind of payload or not, whether it requires payload. Payload in the sense, at the time of login, it is mandatory for us to provide username and password, right? So that is known as a payload. So we also have to get the information whether it requires a payload. In API terminologies, it is known as a payload. Whereas we can also say it as whatever the input. Let's say in terms of login, we require username and password, whether it requires a payload or not. Okay. And now this is like basic things that we require. And then there will be a request format. What kind of request format? That will consist of all these details. So as a part of request format, every details will be provided by the development team. And the last one that we require, these are minimum things that we require. Last thing which we require is a response format. So what should be the response format? If you could have observed earlier, for let's say for this particular example, like there is one API called get all products. For that, the response is entirely different. We can see a JSON response. JSON is known as JavaScript object notation. It is also known as an object in JavaScript. So the format over here is entirely different. This is a data which consists of an array, which again consists of object, which is having key value pair, having ID, product name, product category, and so on. So this is known as a response format. If you see for login, there is a response format like this, which is token, user ID, and message. So every API will have a different kind of response format as well. So what kind of response format that we have, those information we need to get for the API testing. Okay, let's assume that we got every details over here. Example, in terms of request URL, as a part of login validation, this is the URL that we have. Okay, what is the method that we are trying to use over here to call this particular API is this one, which is post. Now, what should be the status code for the response? So we can see it as it is 200. Okay. Whether it requires a payload or not. So whenever we try to use a post or put method, it should require some kind of input value. That means some kind of payload. So if you see the payload over here, whenever any of the API requires a payload, there you will get a payload tab available inside your network tab. Okay, so example, this requires a payload. So whatever the payload that it requires, payload in the sense user input that it requires. So in terms of user input, we have this username and password. So this is the payload that we are trying to use when we try to log in. That is a username and password. So this is the payload that we try to get the value. So request format becomes this kind of things, which is an API, method, status code, and then payload.
But
And
for one question, but for payload, how we should define the username as a fixed, like it's different, na, every time.
yeah, every
User,
time it
yeah,
can be every time
different.
it can be different. So whenever we do a data-driven testing, we'll see in our courses as well. Whenever we do a data-driven testing, we'll get the username, different username from a JSON file or some different files. And we'll see like how can we use a different emails and different password to validate the login scenarios.
Okay, for the time
Here,
being, we used only the
correct, correct,
one your name ID.
correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. And then what is the response format that we have? So this is the response that we are expecting after calling this particular API. So this should be the response that we are, and that we basically need, response we need after calling the API, which is login API. Okay, so these are the things that we require in terms of validation of any of the API, and all these information will be given to you by your development team. Everything will be given to you by your development team. Now let's try to see. We have every details over here. So let's try to see how do we do a manual testing of this particular API. Before that, any question from any one of you? Okay. Okay. So let's see how do we do this validation in terms of API testing over here as a manual API testing. So for that, we'll use a tool known as Postman tool. And here we can click on plus button to form the complete request. You can see like plus button on this. As soon as you click on this, it will ask you to form the API that you are trying to test. Okay. So every details we have, it is over here. It is saying enter user or paste the text, whatever we are trying to test it. So we have an API that will enter over here. Enter URL it is saying. So here it will go an API that we are trying to test. Second, it is saying what kind of method that we are using. So we are trying to use a post method. We select the post from this particular dropdown. This is a dropdown which is displaying each and every methods that we can get inside the API. So we have to select the post method as it requires a post as a method. Now, what is the input that it requires, which is a payload over here, right? So this payload we have to provide as a body. So whenever we try to call any of the API, the body that we have to provide, if it is accepting any kind of body, then body we have to provide it inside the body tab of the Postman. Okay. Apart from that, what it requires, it does not require any other value at this moment. We have given API, we have given the method that it is trying to accept. We have also given a payload, which is the text value or any kind of value that we are trying to enter as a part of user input. Okay. Now we have to click on send button. That means whenever you click on send button, it is trying to say that we are trying to make a request. We are calling this particular API. As soon as we click on send button over here, if everything goes well, then we can first see the status code, which is 200 OK over here. But here also we can see the status code as a part of result by response is 200 OK, which is also displaying over here, right? And as a part of what is response format, how it is displaying. So here we can see it is a token consisting of some value, user ID consists of some value, and then message, which is login successfully over here. The similar format we can observe over here as well, which is token, some value, user ID, some value, and then message, which is login successfully. So the response format is also matching over here. With this, we can say that with the valid login scenarios, whatever the valid login that we have provided, that means the username and password, that this particular API is working in a proper way, right? This is how we test in terms of manual testing. Correct? Any question for this? Okay. Now let's convert these action in terms of automation testing by using Playwright. So we'll see like how do we do these kind of validation if we have to do this by automating these scenarios. Okay, so let's move to again our uh, Visual Studio Code, and here we'll say we'll have to write a method. We basically have to write a test case to validate whether a login API, like API for the login, is working in a proper way or not. That we have seen by using a manual testing that it is working properly. And we also have to validate whether it is displaying the response as token, user ID, message, and whether this API is getting called in a proper way or not. So let's see how do we do these actions in terms of automation. So as we discussed earlier, whenever we have to write any kind of test case, we have to import some of the things which is mandatory as a part of writing the test case over here. So we'll import few things over here. One is test, second is expect, and third we'll also import it a request functions. So these are functions or a method that are available inside Playwright. Okay, now we have discussed earlier, like why do we import test and expect? So whenever we import test, that means we are trying to write a test case. This test function will help us in writing the test case. Expect function will help us in writing the assertion for the test case. And request function will help us in calling the API. Okay, request function will help us in calling the API. Now let's start writing our test case. So how do we write a test case? By using a test function. It requires a couple of parameters. One is a title, which will be unique in nature. So I'll just say it as, let's say API. Inside single quote or double quote, you can say it as API validation. Okay. So I've just given a title as API validation. That means a test title. And then we can write a function over here. And as we are trying to write a function, which is for API, which is for basically API validation. So we do not require any fixtures over here as we have written for the web application. Why did we write a page over here? So that it will launch the browser and it will create a page on the browser. Whereas in terms of API testing, we do not require any kind of browser to be opened. Okay, so we do not require any kind of browser in terms of API testing. So we do not require any fixtures over here. Example, earlier we have written like this, which is page. Here we do not require any kind of fixtures over here. Okay, now first thing, whenever we create any browser, whenever we work for web automation testing, what happens is this page will first create a browser instance. Okay, so this page internally will create automatically for us a browser instance. That means it will launch the browser, and on that browser it will create a page. In terms of API, we do not require a browser, but we require a API context to be created. As I just talked about, in terms of web application, we require a browser context, whatever the browser. Let's say if we are using a Chrome, then we'll have to use a Chrome context. Example, if I talk about, let's say this is a new window application, right? So this is known as a browser context, as we discussed earlier as well. So this is known as a browser context. And on this page, on this particular context, we have one single page only. If you click on this, it will create a new page on this context level. Okay. In the same way, to work with API automation, we have to create a API context. And on that API context, we can call different methods, whatever is required for us in terms of testing. Okay. So how do we call the API? Like how do we basically generate or create the API context? It's a simple by using a request function that we have imported from Playwright. Okay, so how do we create a browser context or API context? By using a request, and on this request we can use a method known as, on this particular we can use a method. So sorry. On this particular request, we can use a method known as new context. Okay, so this new context is a method which will, whenever we use a request, it will create a API context. Okay, so whenever it, if we are trying to, as this request is basically helping us to write the API test cases. And the page that we saw earlier, either a page or a browser, that we'll see going forward, what is browser. But if you see the page is helping us to write the or create the browser instance and create the page on the browser. Whereas this request is helping us to expose API that can be used for web API testing. And if you use this new context method, this will generally create a new context on the API. So if you see the definition, it says that it creates a new instance of API request context. That means we are trying to form first API request. Okay, and this will return us some kind of value. Wherever and whenever you see in JavaScript and TypeScript that promise have been written, that means that particular method or a class or any kind of property that we are trying to use is returning us some kind of value. So here it is returning API request context. And whenever something is, whenever any of the method or any of the call is returning some kind of value, we also have to store it inside a variable, right? So to create a variable, we have a different keyword in JavaScript, which is known as let const var. We'll discuss that in our going forward session. But we have one keyword known as const. By using this const keyword, we can create a variable. So I'll create a variable and we'll give the name as API context. Why did we create a variable which is API context over here? So that we can store the value that this new context is returning us. So if you see, this new context is returning us a API request context. Okay, so what did we do on this line? This line we have created a API context. Okay, you people might be seeing this error, which is highlighting over here in red color. Please ignore that. There are some kind of issues in the latest version of Visual Studio Code. That is where it is displaying this message. But if you try to run this, the code will properly work. Okay, uh, so what did we do over here is we have just created a context which is API context, and that we have stored it inside this particular variable. And now whatever the method that we have to use as a part of API, let's say what method we are trying to use over here, the method is post. So that method we can use it on this particular API context. That means the variable that we have declared, this variable that we have declared over here becomes our main control for handling the API test case. As in case of web automation, this page becomes your complete control of handling each and every test cases or each and every steps on the web application. In the same way, this API context now is your complete control that it will make the whatever the call that we would like to make in terms of API. So here we have, as a part of requirement, we have a post call over here. And if you see, this post call requires a couple of parameters. One is URL. What is this URL? And it is saying this URL we require in string format. Now this URL is the API that we are trying to call. So this will be the URL. So this information we have to provide inside a string. Okay, so how do we write a string in JavaScript? We can create or we can write this string either using single quote or double quote. Now, second, if you see, as a part of post, if you see, it also requires an optional parameter. Some of the optional parameter that it requires. One is body. Body, it says it as a key, which is data. That means whenever we have to provide any kind of payload, we can provide as a key data and then whatever the payload value that we are trying to provide as a value of the data. If we are trying to provide headers, then we can also create a headers as a part of API and that we can provide. I'll show you like going forward as well, like how do we like add different kind of headers, how do we provide different kind of payloads and so on as a part of course as well. So here currently we require a body to be sent out. That means a payload to be sent on along with the API. So we'll use a key as a data. And also one more thing, whenever we write any of the optional parameter in Playwright, that will go inside a curly braces. Curly braces is this symbol. Okay, this is known as a curly braces. So whenever we write any optional parameter, we have to provide that inside a curly braces. Okay, so here for payload, we have a key as data, which is fixed that we have to use over here. So whenever we have to provide a payload, we have to use a data and then colon. And what kind of payload that we have? This is the payload that we are trying to get. So I'll copy it from this one. So we can directly provide the payload that we are trying to provide it over here. So this will be the payload. And currently we are trying to provide a raw data, which will be in the form of string. Okay. So this we have given the data as a payload. What kind of data we have provided over here? So we have to write a curly braces. So this information we have to provide inside a curly braces. So what kind of data we have provided over here? This is the data and the payload are in the string format. Okay. Now, this information that we have provided over here, or what we can do is we can also store this value. What we can do is we can also store this value if it is not looking good directly to provide the data over here. What we can do is we can store it inside a variable. Let's say I'll just make it as const payload over here. And this value, I can store it inside the payload as a variable. And this payload, we can call it over here. Okay. So this becomes the complete API request that we are trying to do, which the method is post. This requires a API over here, whatever the API that we are trying to call. And this is accepting one of a payload. What is the payload? It consists of username and user password. Okay. And now if you hover over on this post method is also returning some kind of value. You see the promise, it is returning API response. So what it sends is what it says this post method is, it sends a HTTPS post request and returns is its response. As we have just discussed a few minutes ago, that whenever a method or any of the call is returning some kind of value for us, that we have to store inside a variable that we can make it as, let's say, API response, and just name the variable as API response over here. This API call will return us some kind of response. So that response we are storing inside a variable known as const API response. Okay. Any question till now? Okay.
Suppose there are 30 APIs, so we have to write on 30 times the same.
So every time we'll have to make a new call for each and every API.
Okay, so that's the means there are 30 APIs, so we have to write the 30 API calls.
So if all the API are trying to do some kind of different operations, then we have to make 30 different calls. If all the API that you are trying to use are trying to make the similar call or similar response it is generating, then we can parameterize this API from here. We can store it inside a file, and from there we can pick the URL.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So it is returning as some kind of value, and that we can print out that we can try to print what kind of information it is returning us. There is a method, there is a command that we have in JavaScript known as console.log. Console.log is a method which is used to print whatever the value that we provided inside on the console. So I'm trying to provide an API response, the complete API response after calling this particular API. So whatever the API response that it is generating over here, it will display, it will basically call the complete, it will display over here or print all the API response that it is generating. Okay. Now, what we have formed is we have formed an API, which is a post. We have call this particular API, which is this particular URL. We have also provided the data. Now let's see what kind of in terms of as a part of this particular API, we should expect a response like this, which is in the JSON format. Along with this response, if you go to Postman, along with this response, it is also returning some kind of headers. There are 19 different types of header, which you do not have to worry, but along with the response, it also displays some kind of headers. But the main response is in the JSON format. So let's say, how do we extract the JSON format response from the API response, complete API response? First, let's try to run this and see whether everything is working properly as we have seen as a part of manual testing. Okay, so how do we run the test case? We know that whenever we have to run the test case, we have to write npx playwright test, and then we can provide the file name. So what is the file name? We have api.spec.js. Okay. Now we are not working with, just a minute. I'll give a couple of minutes. I'll take your questions. So now we are not working with web application. So I'll just call this particular file that we have written, which is API validation over here. We have provided some kind of wrong information. So now we are trying.
Extension is TS instead of
Right,
JS.
right. So I've just changed it out. And now we can see that it has, that means the API that we have formed over here, the API request or request format that we have formed over here is working properly. So it has returned some kind of value. What kind of value? It is saying API response is this. And then there are different kind of header value that it has displayed over here, as we can see inside the Postman as well. Now this response, the exact response that we are getting or that we are generating from the API is in the JSON format. So to get the JSON format of the response, we have to use a method known as .json. Whenever we have to extract any value from the API call in terms of JSON, we have to use a JSON as a method. If you read this definition, it says that returns the JSON representation of the response body. That means this method will parse the complete response of the API, and only the JSON response it will throw us as a part of response. We are also interested in only getting the JSON response, which is displaying over here as a token on the website as well. It is displaying like token, username, and message. Okay. So let's see now again, try to run the test case, and this time we'll see that all these information that it has provided earlier will not be displayed. Only the information that it is generating as a part of JSON, it will display in terms of the result. Now let's again try to call the same test case over here. And this time we'll see that whatever is intention for our API call, it will just display those kind of value. Here it is displaying token. Here it is displaying user ID. Here it's displaying message. Okay. So this is how we can call the API. We can utilize the API, and there will be various other things. Let's say if you have to extract token, we can directly extract from this. This is like in the JSON format. So we can store it inside a variable, the complete response, whatever the response that we are getting over here, we can store it inside a variable, and then by using that variable dot the key name. This is basically key and value pair. JSON will always be in a key and value pair. So what I'm talking over here is I'm trying to print over here instead of this. This JSON will return us some kind of value, which is some value. So we can store it inside a variable. Let's say const, I'll say it as JSON response. And if you just have to get the token value from the complete response, we can print it out over here. Let's say console.log and just say it as await JSON response dot, as it is in the form of JSON, which is known as JavaScript object notation. This is also one of a form of object in JavaScript. So whenever we have to get any data from the object, we can use the um, object identifier dot key for whatever the value that we are trying to get. So now if you see over here, it will just display only the token that it is generating from the complete API response. So this time it will just give us the token that it has generated over here. Okay. So with this, I'll stop our session over here. This is how we generally, take the help of API to create the test cases by using Playwright and to handle the API testing using Playwright. I forgot to mention, but if any one of you are new for the today's sessions, please try to share your name and contact number. As I promised earlier, that after third session, you will get the complete details of the document. So you people can expect after us our today's session that you'll get the document. So if you're new, anyone of the person you are new to this session, please try to share your name and contact numbers so that we can reach you. Yes. So over to you people. Whatever the questions that you have, you can please go ahead. Starting with Dipti, you can start.
Yeah, hi Praveen. I
Yes.
understood the flow. I just have little doubt about the async function. Can you explain that why we have not named it, or it's by syntax that we have to mention the function and then whatever flow we want to explain, we mention there.
Correct. So this is a function. This is a arrow function in JavaScript. We'll discuss like what is arrow function in JavaScript whenever we start with JavaScript. And this
Mhm.
async and await is a concept, as we discussed earlier, that JavaScript is asynchronous in nature. Asynchronous means it will not guarantee us that each and every code, I'm so sorry. So it will not guarantee us that this line of code will be executed as a first line, whenever we start
Mhm.
executing. That means in terms of if we do not write async and await, this will not guarantee that the first line will be executed as a first line, second line will be executed as second line, and so on. This may try to print the last line as well as a uh, first line after starting the execution. So that's where we provide async and await concept to wait for completion of the action of the previous step and then only move to the next step. That is where we use async and await concept. This concept is we also have one of a session for async and await understanding. So that we understand in our first playwright session. Whenever we start a real session for the playwright, we'll first try to understand what is async and await, why do we write that. And second thing, whenever you talk about this one, this is an arrow function in JavaScript. We'll also try to understand in detail what are different types of functions in JavaScript, how do we declare a function, and so on. One way is by just writing this. Second way is you can also use a function keyword over here. So if you use a function keyword, then we have to remove JSON, JSON response. Just give me JSON response dot token. So instead of writing this, we can also write just a function and then this one. So this will also work in the same way. Whenever we try to write arrow function, instead of writing this function as a keyword, we just place it a arrow symbol over here. That we'll discuss in JavaScript session.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Um, yes, Kiza, I'll go over to you for this next question.
Okay, my
Uh,
question is almost the same of what you just asked. I was wondering if we can, obviously, like in this class, there is people with different experience level. I was wondering if you can create some kind of like a cheat sheet note or just more in depth in terms of like going to use async, await, constant, the arrow, if that's possible, so that we're able to understand better when it comes to writing different code.
right, right.
Mm.
I understand your concern. The first thing is we are still in like the public session, which is also known as a demo session, where
Okay.
we were going through with some of the concept. But as you said, I have written everything in detail. If you see like why do we use async and await concept, explanation of why do we use a test function over here, what is like playwright test whenever we start writing the test cases, why do we use test function over here, what is the use of async function, what is like async function, why do we write async,
Okay. Okay, so you
and
have that.
why do we have function. I believe earlier also said that this course have been designed not only for the technical person, it is
Mhm.
also for the person who do not have any understanding of technical
Okay.
part.
Okay, my next question to that, I saw that in the WhatsApp group, it said demo day 2, but I think some of us who started from day 1, I mean, I've already paid for the class. Isn't today supposed to be kind of like the third day instead of like day 2 demo?
Right,
And do
right.
we get a
So
different link for people who've already paid, or is it the same? Do we continue using the same link that you send out to our emails?
uh, so that have been taken care by the Isha team.
Okay.
The day one that we provide, they'll not consider that as a real classes. They'll just consider
Okay.
as a demo classes where
Yeah.
the people join. And you are right. Whoever have paid for the session, you'll get either from the next session or from the next session, you'll get another link for joining the meeting.
Okay. So tomorrow is not a demo class, it's the actual class then.
Should be.
Okay. Okay. That's what I wanted to know. And then the document that you have where explain the same functions, you will be able to share that document with everyone who already paid for the class. I'm
Yes.
getting.
Yes.
Okay. That's good to know. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Now I'll go to Abhishek.
Yep, my voice is audible, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, just wanted to confirm one thing, Praveen. Like, if you go into the editor,
Okay. So I'll request here people, if you are new to the session, please provide your name and contact number. If you are not new, like you have attended and you have already provided your contact number and name, please ignore. Yes, Abhishek.
yeah. So I just wanted to confirm, like, I can see these red lines, right? So it's kind of denoting some errors there. So basically, is it kind of inbuilt plugin which is confirming with you regarding like it's an error or something like that, or is just a kind of like spacing issues like or something like
No,
that is
no.
noting down?
Right, right. So this is not an issue. If you see over here, it is displaying everything proper. So there is some kind of issue in the Visual Studio Code for the recent version that they have launched. There are some kind of issues that it is happening along with this. So it fixes automatically whenever we restart our system. But this has started happening from the last couple of days. I'm trying to find out the
Oh.
solution. What is the best solution to mitigate this? Should not display over here. So this is not an issue either of a spacing or of any kind of plugin.
Okay, so like if we start any kind of coding in our area, we might get kind of these issues, right? Like these red lines.
You might, but if you go back to the previous version of Visual Studio Code, it is working in a proper way.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. Thanks.
Okay, so
Then
this is not
that's
an
fine.
issue. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Thanks. Good to know. Yeah. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, great. Over to you, Rahul. Rahul, if you have any question, I see you have raised a hand.
Yes, actually, I did not get a document. I have already shared email or like mobile number.
Hmm, hmm. Okay. So, as I said earlier, after our third session, you will definitely get the documents that we have discussed. Um, if you have provided your email, you'll definitely get that after our third session.
Sure. And today, actually, I late join due to technical issues. So this today API class. So this is the last class or first class, or can you repeat this one tomorrow?
This is basically currently last class of the API, but we will definitely again discuss as a part of our session. That means as a past part of our course and course content, we'll discuss everything once again in detail. So if you go to our course content that we have over here, I'll show you one more time. So we have course content over here that we have developed. So if you see over here, we will we'll be covering a basics of API as well, and we'll write one more script to understand how do we call the API, how can we utilize this API to write along with the web application. So here, if you see as a part of our today's session, we have just found the token, right? This token we can also utilize inside a web application or web like website testing, where we can use this token to skip the login part. Those kind of validation we'll see in our Playwright courses. So whatever I have discussed in our session today, everything once again will be discussed at the time of going through the real sessions.
Okay. And okay, yesterday I create code, but I run code, so getting error.
What kind of error are you getting?
Code is not running, and I'm showing.
Okay, so I'll get connected with you
Mm.
in a separate session.
Sure.
I'll help you with that. Okay, great. Any other question, Rahul, from your side?
Done from us, I think.
Okay, Navina, over to you.
Hey, hi, Praveen.
Right.
So once the real class starts, is it gonna be a hands-on? Like, are we going to do along with you, creating starting from installation, creating test, and calling it test, etc. Or how is it going to going forward? What's the plan?
So we will be basically checking first the installation part, the complete
Hmm.
requirement, what kind of system requirement we need to have to write JavaScript code and then Playwright. So all those installation we'll be doing, and then we'll again be starting from completely from scratch. Whenever we start with Playwright, that means whatever I have covered, that doesn't mean like I'll skip those scenarios. I'll go once again in detail um, to make like understand why do we write test, why do we write async functions, and so on. Everything will be discussed in detail along with the installation part as well.
Okay, and how about while developing that test? Is it gonna be hands-on while obviously you have to explain how does it work, but while you're doing any just taking an example, for example, login call, are we going to write parallelly alongside with you, or is it
It
like
depends
you
on
explain?
if depends on if you are looking for writing parallelly, you can still write. If you are looking to practice it out later on, that also you can do. But from my side, you will get an assignment so that you have to cover that you have to complete
Okay,
either within a week time or whenever you get a free time. You have to cover those assignment.
okay, makes sense. Thanks, Praveen.
Okay, okay. Any other question from anyone else? Okay, great. So if nothing else, then thanks a lot everyone for joining once again.